Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a story of absolute, ground-shaking structural upheaval. Picture the Russian Empire in the late 19th century for a second. It's this landscape of really stark contradictions. On one hand, you have an archaic absolute autocracy ruling over millions of impoverished peasants. But on the other hand, rapid, state-sponsored industrialization is suddenly erupting in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, creating a deeply exploited industrial working class. It was literally a pressure cooker of feudal structures and modern capitalism. And within this incredibly volatile matrix, one man systematically built the theoretical and organizational framework to just blow it all up. So how exactly did one man in a sealed train bring down a 300-year-old empire? That's the core question anchoring our entire analysis today. How did a single, intensely focused intellectual use tactical brilliance and ruthless pragmatism to completely reshape the 20th century geopolitical landscape? The mechanisms he designed are absolutely fascinating to break down.
Let's jump into part 1, Tragedy to Radical Theory, the Crucible of Simbirsk.
We start with the early life of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, the man the world would eventually know as Lenin. Born in the provincial city of Simbirsk, he wasn't actually born into poverty. He came from a stable, educated middle-class family that really valued literature and social progress. But that stability was about to be completely derailed. In a brutal, rapid succession of tragedies starting in 1886, his father suddenly dies of a brain hemorrhage. Just a year later, his brilliant older brother Alexander is hanged for treason after taking part in a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. And then, mere months after that, Vladimir himself is expelled from university for a peaceful protest. This forced the young Ulyanov into deep social isolation, a period he spent intensely reading and immersing himself in Karl Marx's Das Kapital.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the brutal tactical lesson Lenin took from his brother's execution. Alexander had followed the Narodnik strategy, basically the belief that individual acts of terror by intellectual elites would spark massive peasant uprisings. Lenin realized this was entirely futile. It just replaced one autocrat with another, right? Instead, drawing heavily from Marx, he concluded that true change required a mass revolution, driven inevitably by the growing industrial working class.
Which brings us to part 2, Birth of the Vanguard, crafting a revolutionary weapon. Moving into the 1890s, Lenin took these theories to St. Petersburg's underground Marxist circles. But, as you might expect, his organizing efforts quickly led to arrests, and eventually a 3-year internal exile in a remote Siberian village alongside his political partner and wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya. It was during this exile that he truly codified his strategy. The absolute crux of it comes from his seminal 1902 pamphlet, What is to be Done? Lenin identified a massive problem. Workers left on their own only develop what he called trade union consciousness. Essentially, they just want better wages and shorter hours within the existing system. To break that cycle and actually overthrow the state, they needed a vanguard party. Think about how radical this is. Lenin was basically saying the working class could never achieve revolution on their own. They required an elite, highly centralized, disciplined organization of professional revolutionaries to guide them from the outside.
When Lenin tried to implement this idea at a 1903 Party Congress, a fierce debate erupted. Julius Martov wanted a broad, inclusive mass party. They became the Bolsheviks. But Lenin demanded a restrictive, highly disciplined weapon of active participants. Thanks to a temporary walkout by some delegates, Lenin won a narrow vote and pragmatically seized the label of Bolsheviks, which means majority. Even though they often had way fewer members in the years that followed, Lenin ruthlessly held on to the psychological advantage of that title. It was a brilliant move, honestly.
Moving right along to part 3, Chaos in the Sealed Train, the Imperialist Catastrophe.
Let's set the stage in 1914. The outbreak of the First World War was an immense tragedy globally, but for the exiled Bolsheviks, it presented a profound revolutionary opportunity. Lenin was marooned in neutral Switzerland at the time, and he was absolutely furious. Socialist parties all across Europe had chosen to support their own nations in the war, rather than standing together as an international working class. In response, he formulated a strategy called revolutionary defeatism. Consider how intense this stance was. He argued the war was just a capitalist conflict for colonies, and that the absolute best thing a revolutionary could do was actually work for the total defeat of their own country's government. And this leads to a moment of pure geopolitical irony. Early 1917, the Tsarist state finally collapses, and the Tsar abdicates. But Lenin is still stuck in Switzerland, while the German high command realized that sending an anti-war radical back into Russia would perfectly destabilize their military opponent. So they actually funded and facilitated Lenin's transit across enemy lines in a sealed train carriage, literally making sure he couldn't get out and spread his ideas in Germany on the way. He finally arrives at Petrograd's Finland station in April 1917.
All right, part 4, seizing the state, the mechanics of insurrection.
Arriving back in Russia, Lenin finds a country in a state of dual power. It's split between a formal provisional government of liberal politicians and the Soviets, these councils of workers and soldiers. Everyone expected Lenin to just join the broad democratic coalition. Instead, he stunned his own allies by refusing to collaborate whatsoever. He drops the April thesis. No support for the provisional government. End the war immediately. Transfer all power to the Soviets. Nationalize the land. At first, people thought he was politically delusional. But by aligning these hyper-focused demands with the masses' desperate cries for peace, land, and bread, Lenin expertly positioned the Bolsheviks as the absolute only true alternative to a failing status quo. So by the summer of 1917, tensions are boiling over, and Lenin is briefly forced into hiding in Finland. He used this downtime to write his core political philosophy, The State and Revolution. He argued that the state is just an instrument of class rule. You can't just take over the existing bourgeois government. You have to completely shatter its apparatus and replace it with a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat, which is essentially absolute rule by the working class. His intent to dismantle the existing state wasn't just a threat, it was an absolute promise.
Now, when October 1917 finally rolls around, forget the movie scenes of a chaotic mob storming the palace gates. That is not what happened. It was a methodical, highly organized, infrastructural takeover orchestrated by Leon Trotsky under Lenin's intense, demanding pressure. They basically used the Soviets' Military Revolutionary Committee as legal cover. Disciplined detachments systematically seized the nervous system of the city: the post offices, the telephone exchanges, the banks, the railways. The provisional government was besieged in the Winter Palace, and the state changed hands with remarkable efficiency.
And finally, Part 5. The cost of power, consolidation, and pragmatism. Seizing power is one thing. Keeping it in a collapsing country, that required extreme, sometimes brutal pragmatism. Lenin demonstrated right away that his commitment to democratic norms was strictly instrumental. When the Bolsheviks lost the national elections for the Constituent Assembly in early 1918, Lenin simply ordered armed Red Guards to lock the doors and dissolve the assembly after just one day. He also swallowed the deeply humiliating Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, surrendering vast territories to Germany just to buy his infant government a breathing space to survive. This ruthless adaptability was crucial during the Civil War. To win, he implemented war communism, total nationalization, banning private trade, and forcibly requisitioning grain. It won the war, sure, but caused catastrophic famine and led to the Kronstadt naval revolt. Realizing the regime was on the verge of total collapse, Lenin instantly pivoted. He enacted the new economic policy, a strategic retreat to state-regulated capitalism, allowing small-scale private retail to save the economy.
But here's the twist. Lenin wouldn't even live to manage the massive state he violently birthed. Beginning in 1922, a series of paralyzing strokes severely limited him. In 1924, at just 53 years old, Vladimir Lenin died. In his final dictations, his testament, he desperately warned the party against Joseph Stalin's accumulating unlimited authority, urging his removal. It was a tragic irony, honestly, a warning that arrived far too late to stop the rise of the very man who would inherit his massive, centralized machine.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We've traced the journey of an intellectual who systematically analyzed the weaknesses of his era and built a highly disciplined weapon to exploit them. So as you look at the power dynamics of our modern world, consider this. How do the mechanisms of the vanguard party, the strategic infrastructural takeover, and the absolute centralization of authority still resonate today?
Please like and subscribe.